Why did the Navy bury the truth about the Ghost Blimp for decades?
Shadow Archive.
The morning of August 16, 1942, broke cool and gray over San Francisco Bay. A thick marine layer hung low above the Pacific, swallowing the horizon in a wall of fog. From the airfield on Treasure Island, L-8, a U.S. Navy blimp used for coastal patrol, inflated quietly like a leviathan coming to life. It was part of the Navy's lighter-than-air fleet, an answer to the mounting U-boat threat lurking off the American coast. Two men climbed aboard, Lieutenant Ernest Dewitt Cody, 27, and Ensign Charles Adams, 38. Both experienced airmen, both calm under pressure. Their mission was routine. A sweep over the Farallon Islands and back, scanning for enemy submarines. They carried life jackets, signal flares, a machine gun, and a classified radio frequency to report in. The latched engines whined to life, the blimp lifted gently, and by 6 a.m., it disappeared into the mist over the bay. They never returned. By 7:42 a.m., the L-8 had radioed that it spotted something suspicious in the water near the Farallons, an oil slick, potentially the sign of a submarine. That was the last confirmed communication. Ground stations tried to make contact again. No reply. Radar lost track of the blimp briefly, then picked it up again, but with no response from the crew. At 11:15 a.m., bathers on Ocean Beach looked up to see the massive silver envelope of the blimp sagging unnaturally, barely holding altitude. It drifted inland, passing silently over houses and buildings in Daly City. Then, without warning, it came down, gently, onto a residential street, crashing into a utility pole and settling atop a parked car. Firefighters and Navy personnel rushed to the scene. What they found inside was more baffling than anyone expected. The gondola was intact. The control panel was functional. The radio worked. Emergency gear was untouched. But both crewmen, Cody and Adams, were gone. Vanished, midair, from a sealed aircraft still in flight. There were no signs of struggle. No blood. No parachutes missing. The door to the gondola was latched from the inside. The safety lines were still coiled. It was as if the men had simply evaporated into the fog. Panic spread quickly. Newspapers dubbed it the Ghost Blimp. The Navy scrambled to locate its missing crew, scouring the coast with ships and aircraft. The official investigation began almost immediately, and with it, a growing list of questions that no one could answer. How could two trained officers disappear from a flying blimp with no damage, no distress signal, and no trace? The Navy's internal report was thorough, yet troubling. L-8's engines were functional. Its helium envelope had remained intact, aside from minor damage sustained during the crash. The controls were in normal positions. The blimp had simply drifted, unattended, for nearly 5 hours, floating over the densely populated Bay Area, navigating the sky like an abandoned ghost. But the more investigators searched, the stranger it became. 2 of the 3 parachutes were still aboard. All life vests remained stowed. The onboard .30 caliber machine gun was untouched, its ammunition unspent. The emergency raft was in its compartment. No water or fuel leaks. The cabin door, a spring-loaded hatch designed to stay shut in flight, was secured upon landing, and could not have accidentally opened midair. Even the blimp's secret ASW, anti-submarine warfare, codes were found sealed and in place, untouched. A nearby fishing trawler, the Daisy Gray, later reported seeing the blimp circling unusually low around the Farallons, then climbing sharply into the clouds. The captain had assumed it was responding to something in the water. Other eyewitnesses along the coast saw it later, flying erratically. But none saw anyone fall. No cries for help, just a drifting airship, as silent and eerie as the fog itself. At Treasure Island, where the mission had begun, Cody and Adams were known as meticulous. Cody, a graduate of the Naval Academy, had already flown dozens of similar patrols. Adams, a seasoned balloon pilot, had once served as a blimp instructor. Neither man had reason to jump. Neither had issued a distress call. Within days, wild theories surfaced in the press. Had they been abducted by enemy agents midair? Perhaps surfacing Nazis had captured them during a sea inspection. A bold, if improbable, maneuver. Some claimed they saw a submarine that morning, though no wreckage or enemy contact was ever confirmed. Others speculated they had jumped to avoid some onboard hazard, perhaps toxic fumes or mechanical failure, but such problems would have left obvious traces. One theory bordered on the surreal, that they simply walked away from the mission, abandoning ship mid-flight to start new lives. But no evidence supported this. Both men had left behind money, families, and promising careers. And no sightings, living or dead, ever emerged. By September, the story had captivated the nation. The military clamped down, restricting details. The question now haunting the Navy was not just what happened to Cody and Adams, but who, or what, was with them in the sky. Weeks passed. The Navy widened its search, dispatching patrol boats, aircraft, and dive teams to comb the waters around the Farallon Islands. Wreckage was always a possibility. If the men had somehow fallen overboard, the sea could have claimed them. But no bodies surfaced, no gear washed ashore, and no sign of a struggle ever emerged. The case files grew thick with speculation. Interviews with fellow officers revealed no behavioral red flags. Cody had been described as focused, even-tempered, deeply committed to his role. Adams, slightly older, was a mentor figure to junior officers, respected, if occasionally aloof. There were no signs of mental distress, no debts, no disagreements with superiors. If there had been foul play between the two men, it left no mark. Naval engineers examined the L-8 again, this time with an eye for sabotage. Could something mechanical have forced the men to exit the craft mid-flight? But the controls were responsive. The helium cells were stable. The only notable issue was ballast. The blimp had risen sharply after 7:42 a.m., possibly indicating a rapid loss of weight. But that only confirmed what everyone already feared. The men had left the ship at altitude. The theory gaining quiet traction inside naval intelligence was far darker. Reports had surfaced, classified at the time, of Japanese submarines operating off the California coast. Months earlier, the I-17 had shelled a refinery near Santa Barbara. Could L-8 have encountered another vessel that morning? A stealth attack, perhaps? A captured crew taken aboard as prisoners? But if so, why would the blimp have continued flying? But to those who had seen the empty gondola firsthand, it was unforgettable. Two men had vanished without a trace from a sealed aircraft in full flight, over a major American city, in broad daylight. Unpiloted, for hours? Why no distress signal? No damage? And how would a submarine abduct two airmen without being seen? Wartime paranoia offered no answers, only more shadows. One obscure possibility floated through the ranks, a secret defection. Perhaps the men had been approached before the mission, coerced or bribed. Enemy operatives were known to be active in West Coast ports, embedded among civilian workers. But this, too, faltered under scrutiny. Neither man had foreign ties. Neither had exhibited strange behavior. And there was no evidence, bank records, communication, surveillance, to suggest any treasonous intent. Publicly, the Navy ruled it an accident. Unexplained, yes, but not suspicious. Privately, however, the file remained open under a different label, Code Alpha 7. Reserved for unsolved cases with potential intelligence implications. The kind of label that meant someone, somewhere, didn't believe it was just a tragic fluke. Meanwhile, L8's wreckage, now repaired and flying again, cast a strange shadow wherever it went. Superstitious sailors refused to board it. Some claimed it brought bad luck. Others whispered it was haunted, cursed by the last breath of its missing crew. And then, in 1943, something unexpected happened. A civilian fishing vessel recovered an object tangled in its nets, miles from the Farallon Islands. It was a Navy-issued flight helmet, faded, sea-worn, but unmistakable. Inside was a faintly engraved name. Cody. There was no blood, no bone, no body. Just the helmet, and a renewed silence from the Navy. They retrieved the item quietly. No press release, no follow-up search. It was as if the sea had given up a clue, and the Navy had buried it. The helmet was flown under armed escort to Naval Air Station Moffett Field. There, inside a secure hangar, Forensics teams examined it under strict confidentiality. The outer shell was pitted with salt damage, consistent with long-term exposure to seawater. Barnacle traces suggested it had rested on the ocean floor, not just drifted. But it was what they didn't find that disturbed investigators more. No biological material, no hair, no blood, no tears in the inner lining. The chin strap was still fastened. It looked as if it had been carefully removed and discarded, not torn off in a struggle or high-altitude fall. And it had no corrosion consistent with prolonged immersion at deep depths. Meaning, experts concluded, it had entered the water months after the disappearance. As if someone, or something, had placed it there deliberately. The coordinates of its discovery were 18 miles northeast of the Farallon Islands, far outside the expected drift pattern. Navy oceanographers conducted current simulations and quietly concluded that no known natural forces could have transported the helmet from the L8's original patrol zone to that location. Unless the blimp had gone much farther off course than believed. Or unless the helmet had been moved by human hands. A new theory began to surface behind closed doors. What if the crew had landed? Not crash-landed, but landed intentionally, somewhere remote, perhaps on the Farallons themselves. The islands, barren and treacherous, had once housed whaling stations and were occasionally used by fishermen. But they were also known for their strange geography. Narrow coves, hidden caves, and frequent fog that could cloak anything from aircraft to ships. The Navy dispatched a covert team to survey the islands, citing a training exercise. They found nothing. Except for a rusted steel ring embedded in a cliffside, as if once used to moor a vessel. No recent footprints, no remains, just wind, gulls, and the pounding sea. But back in San Francisco, rumors swirled among dockworkers and ship crews. One tugboat operator claimed he saw L-8 flying abnormally low over the Presidio that morning, not just drifting, but under control. He insisted the gondola door was open and that he glimpsed movement inside. But his account was dismissed. Too late, too uncertain. A pattern was forming, not of answers, but of omission. Every time a possible clue surfaced, it was quietly downplayed or buried. The helmet was placed in an evidence vault and marked classified, not to be disclosed. The official story remained unchanged. Mechanical failure, presumed lost at sea. But among certain officers, doubts lingered. Some whispered that L-8 had encountered something over the water that morning, not a submarine, but something else. Something that forced the crew to abandon ship not in panic, but in silence. Some began studying the brief 7:42 a.m. transmission again. Investigating suspicious oil slick. Stand by. It wasn't a report of contact. It wasn't a distress call. It was incomplete. And the next transmission never came. In 1944, a full year after the incident, the L-8 mystery was officially closed. The final report, redacted and rephrased, concluded the disappearance had been due to unforeseen circumstances during routine operations. It cited possible mechanical failure, despite no evidence of such. The case files were sealed. Families were given folded flags, carefully worded condolences, and silence. But the war hadn't dulled the strange magnetism of the story. Civilian interest persisted, fueled by whispers and sightings. A lighthouse keeper stationed on Point Reyes in early 1943 claimed to have seen two figures climbing the rocks just after sunrise one morning, both in gray flight suits. When he called out, they ducked behind a ridge and vanished. A search turned up nothing, and the man later retracted his statement under pressure. Even stranger were the rumors from within the Navy's own Psychological Operations Division. A declassified memo, dated late 1943, contained a cryptic line. Incident Alpha 7, recommend compartmentalization. Information anomaly poses risk to morale and operational focus. Information anomaly. Not disappearance. Not enemy contact. Something unexplainable, and perhaps dangerous, to even ask about. As the war dragged on, L-8 itself was stripped of its mystery. Its gondola was repainted, its insignias removed. It flew over football games and public events, part of the Navy's PR campaign. The public no longer connected it to the mystery. Time faded the story from headlines, and Cody and Adams became mere footnotes. But not for everyone. In the 1950s, retired radar technician Harold Bryce, then in his 60s, gave a recorded interview to a local radio show. He claimed that, on the morning of August 16, 1942, while stationed at the Pillar Point radar facility, he had tracked an unusual aerial object trailing behind L-8 during its descent toward Daly City. It was small, like a plane without wings, he said. Stuck close to the blimp for about 10 minutes. Then it veered off. Fast. Too fast for anything we had back then. Bryce said he filed a report. He never saw it again. When asked why he waited so long to speak, he simply said, "Because I was told not to." His story was never verified. The Navy declined to comment. But shortly after Bryce's death in 1959, his widow found something hidden in the crawlspace beneath their home, wrapped in oilskin, tucked inside a rusted metal case. A small logbook. Its pages were water-damaged and fragile, but one entry was legible, dated August 15, 1942, the night before the mission. In Cody's handwriting. "Something on the radar we can't ID. Adams says it's noise. I'm not so sure. We'll log again if it returns." It was the last line in the book. Cody never logged again. By the 1960s, the story of the Ghost Blimp had all but disappeared from public memory. America was racing toward the moon, its attention consumed by rockets and the Cold War. But for a small group of retired Navy officers, the L-8 case remained a quiet obsession. One of them was Commander James Elroy, who had been stationed at Treasure Island the morning of the flight. In private, he kept a locked drawer filled with press clippings, personnel files, and hand-marked flight maps, his own archive of everything the Navy had never explained. His notes suggested something deeper than curiosity. He was investigating something. In his personal journal, later discovered after his death, Elroy wrote of patterns among West Coast patrol flights between 1942 and 1943. A handful of blimps and aircraft had reported strange radar echoes, momentary equipment failures, or unexplained lights over the Pacific. None were logged officially. Most were dismissed. But Elroy saw a pattern forming, all clustered around a 50-mile radius west of San Francisco, centering on the Farallon Trench. A deep underwater chasm, rarely charted. In 1966, Elroy interviewed the last living technician from the original L-8 radio room. The man, suffering from cancer, agreed to speak under the condition his name never be published. What he said added a final, chilling wrinkle. He claimed that at 7:41 a.m., 1 minute before the last transmission, Cody had briefly opened a second channel, one reserved for emergency off-the-record messages. The technician recalled hearing only a single phrase before the signal cut off. "Adams sees it too." "It's not." Then silence. He never heard the rest. No one did. The Navy erased the log of that channel's use. But the technician had kept a copy, scrawled onto a napkin and hidden in an envelope in his locker. Elroy saw it, photographed it, and filed it away with a note. "This is what they've buried." Elroy died in 1972. His papers went untouched for decades. Then, in 1993, a researcher at the National Archives stumbled upon the L-8 files while cataloging World War II aviation records. Tucked inside a box labeled Miscellaneous Aerial Incidents was a sealed envelope marked with an outdated clearance level. Inside were 3 photos, grainy black and whites, taken from a reconnaissance aircraft that had tracked the L-8's descent on August 16, 1942. 2 showed the blimp. The third showed something else. A dark, rounded shape hovering above the cloud layer, faint, almost indistinguishable. The photo had no label, no timestamp, no context. Just one word scribbled on the back, in faded pencil. Observer. The photo was refiled, the envelope resealed. Officially, nothing had changed. The Navy still considered the incident closed. But for those who had followed the case for decades, the message was clear. Whatever Cody and Adams had seen that morning, whatever had caused them to vanish without a trace from a functioning aircraft, had left behind not just mystery, but warning. They had witnessed something. And someone didn't want the world to know. The blimp had returned without them. But something else may have been watching, from above or below. And in the thick fog over the Pacific, two men had crossed an invisible line, one that no radar could track and no report could explain. In 2003, a team of marine biologists conducting a sonar scan of the Farallon Trench encountered an anomaly. At 1,200 feet below the surface, on the edge of a steep underwater cliff, they recorded a perfectly symmetrical indentation, nearly 60 feet long, as if something heavy had settled there, then disappeared. They assumed it to be geological, a sinkhole or a collapsed reef shelf. But one image captured by a submersible drone showed something else. Nestled in the sediment was a corroded steel object with a faint marking barely visible under layers of growth and salt. U.S. Navy 1942. The object was never recovered. Funding for the expedition was abruptly cut, and the team was instructed to redirect their work further south, toward Monterey Canyon. No explanation was given. One of the researchers, disillusioned, leaked the image years later under a pseudonym. Internet forums speculated wildly. Some claimed it was part of the L8's original undercarriage. Others said it was unrelated debris. But the dimensions, the placement, the date. It raised the oldest question again. Had the blimp touched down at sea? And if it had, who took the crew? In 2015, as part of a historical documentary on wartime aviation, a researcher gained limited access to Treasure Island's decommissioned archives. While sifting through deteriorating film canisters, she found a reel labeled simply, L8, Incident Footage, Daly City. It was raw 16mm film, partially degraded. But in the flickering frames, she saw the crash scene clearly. The gondola resting on the rooftop of a car, crowds gathering, Navy men scrambling over the wreckage. Then, in a brief 12-second sequence shot from a nearby rooftop, something caught her eye. Just above the blimp, faint, at cloud level, was a shape. Oval, stationary, blurred by fog, but unmistakably out of place. Not a bird, not a plane. A still frame from the sequence was isolated, digitally enhanced, and compared to atmospheric anomalies. The shape didn't match any known aircraft from the 1940s. No wings, no rotors, no contrail. The documentary never aired. The footage was pulled before broadcast. The researcher later received a cease and desist letter from a retired Navy contractor. The letter stated the material was still subject to national security protocols under post-war intelligence agreements. The footage disappeared. But a single frame survived online, posted anonymously, then taken down within 24 hours. It was labeled L8 with passenger. In 2021, on the 79th anniversary of the Ghost Blimp's flight, a podcast called Cold Skies released a special episode. It featured declassified Navy communications from the war, including some filtered audio recovered from obsolete magnetic tape backups. One clip stood out, marked as unverified, unknown origin. Crackling, faint static, then a voice. It's still there, we're ascending, no response, object, hovering, lights changing, more static, then silence. The voice was identified by audio engineers as matching Lieutenant Ernest Dewitt Cody. The date stamp on the recording? August 16, 1942. Time, 7:44 a.m. 2 minutes after the last official transmission. This final fragment had never been included in the investigation. It had been stored, labeled incorrectly, and forgotten, or perhaps intentionally misfiled. When the podcast episode aired, listeners around the world flooded forums with theories. UFO communities reignited. Aviation historians demanded answers. The Navy offered none. And yet, something curious happened in the days after the episode was released. A private company operating weather balloons near the Farallon Islands reported that one of its GPS-tracked high-altitude probes had gone off course, rising sharply, then vanishing from radar. The last transmission, logged automatically at 65,000 feet, read, "Object detected. Light distortion, redirecting." It never transmitted again. Just like the L8.